Hello and welcome to the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Rania Khalek, and today I am joined by, Eugene has changed a lot. It's because it's not Eugene. Eugene Puryear is out this week. He's traveling for some important breakthrough work abroad. So we've got with us Breakthrough's very own Kei Pritsker. Kei, thank you for joining me to guest host and fill in those shoes that Eugene left.
Great to be here. Eugene's got way bigger feet than me, way bigger shoes to fill, but hopefully I can do it justice this week. But yeah, sorry to disappoint all the Eugene fans out there. I will do my best tonight to carry his spirit forward.
Well, Kei, we have full faith in you, and I think there's a lot of Kei fans who are excited to see you on today. I'm certainly excited to be beside you virtually. We have a great show planned today, but before we get into it, I want to mention that for those who are watching, make sure that you smash that like button, you guys.
Smash that like button.
Music to my ears. Eugene hates that sound, and he is not here to criticize it. Ha! Eugene, if you're watching. But no, make sure you hit that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. And also, if you want to help support Breakthrough News, you can become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can access exclusive merch as well as exclusive content, including parts of my show Dispatches, as well as other really cool stuff. And also, most importantly, you'll be helping grow independent media, which we need now more than ever, because actually, Kei, this is the first show we're doing since Trump became president.
Yeah, and I think like everyone else, we have also just been maybe caught off guard a little bit just in the whirlwind of appointments, which we're obviously going to be talking about today. But I think in this era, in this administration, I feel like independent media and like a sort of counter narrative will probably be even more important than it was in the last 4 years, not just on the issue of Palestine, but on so many different issues like immigration and Iran that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, that's a really dark, dark world that we're in at the moment. The thing it was already dark.
Yes.
It just got a lot darker because now we've got a bunch of Armageddon enthusiasts. Actually, I don't know what to call them. I guess we could say they're kind of like Armageddon enthusiasts that Trump has stacked his administration with, which, like you said, we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the escalating violence in the West Bank. We're going to be talking about what to expect with this kind of new immigration apparatus we're going to see under this figure, Stephen Miller, who's a very dangerous figure. And this is on top of a really already draconian immigration system where Democrats deport sometimes more than Republicans do. But there's a lot to be concerned about. And we're also going to touch on the riots by Israeli soccer hooligans in Amsterdam and all of the propaganda, the tsunami, I should say, of propaganda that came out around that to try to portray that as some sort of oppression against Jews. And again, that goes back to why independent media is so important, you guys. I mean, that is like the perfect example of how the media can really manufacture an entire story that goes against all reality, including video evidence, except for, weirdly, the Daily Mail. So we're going to have someone on to talk about that. I'm really looking forward to that topic. And yeah, special guest host, Kei Pritsker. No pressure on you to fill those shoes for Eugene, but all the pressure in the world. Feel free to troll Kei in the comments. I'm just kidding. Don't.
Yeah, no, I've got the live chat up, so I'll be receiving live feedback, and if I'm messing up, I'll just walk off, and you'll have to take the rest.
Kei, you're fantastic. Me and Kei actually just got back last week from reporting in Dearborn, Michigan during the election, and I think we're both still kind of like recovering from the whiplash of not just Trump being reelected, but all of these cabinet picks. So I guess all that's to say, I think we should just go ahead and jump right into it. I'd love to introduce our first guest, Adnan Kuzmar. He is an independent Tulkarm-based journalist / researcher in the West Bank. Adnan, welcome.
Shukran. Thank you for having me.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. And, Gaza has obviously been one of the major headlines because of the horrific genocide that's been taking place there for over a year. We've had you on before to discuss the targeted attacks on journalists in Gaza, which continue till now. But because the violence in Gaza is just so atrocious and grotesque, it's really overshadowed the horrific, unprecedented levels of violence taking place across the West Bank. So can you kind of give us a breakdown, a kind of brief explanation of the violence that we're seeing taking place in the West Bank, and how much of that is related to recent statements we've heard by the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, of Israel, talking about wanting to annex the West Bank and officially make it part of Israel?
These calls and plans for the annexation of the West Bank are being treated as almost like a new milestone, while I think it's rather a natural outcome of two long-standing things. First, ideological trajectories within the Israeli leadership that basically have continuously called for and implemented on the ground measures that entrench the Israeli occupation and internally displaced and even externally displaced Palestinians across the West Bank, trying to cram Palestinians in as small area as possible. That plan has been happening since practically day one of the occupation, more than 55 years ago. And the other long-standing factor driving this is the continued international support that Israel enjoys and helps Israel by preventing any form of accountability for the crimes that the prolonged occupation of the West Bank involves. So these are the two main drivers, and this is a natural progression rather than somehow a turning point in the history of the West Bank. In terms of the increased attacks, again, we see the media focusing on attacks that take place inside Palestinian areas, perhaps because that's where the majority of the population are, but these attacks have never stopped, particularly in so-called Area C, where Palestinians are prevented from merely inhabiting their own lands, whether that's construction, farming, or any other economic activity. In terms of even the attacks against the cities, this is a trend that has started a long time ago, well before October 7. For example, the first incursion that involved bulldozers attacking infrastructure in the city of Tulkarem, where I live, took place in May 2023. And even though these attacks have increased in intensity and frequency since October 7th, in terms of the pattern of behavior for the army, it's largely the same. Elsewhere, I have, particularly when I'm writing about this, I've talked about an element that suggests that there is some sort of a practice or training for the Israeli army to withhold Palestinian cities and hold large numbers of Palestinians inside these cities under curfew and basically keep them under control for a prolonged period of time. And that pattern was quite obvious in 2023, where the army would come in certain incursions and stay for a few hours, and always the next incursion would involve a longer period, perhaps also larger areas of the city that are directly targeted. For example, in the city of Tulkarem in 2023, there was 70 people who were killed by these attacks. In 2024, so far, we have 125. Obviously, Tulkarem is one of the main cities that are being targeted, but the number of those killed across the West Bank in 2023 was over 500. And so far in 2024, we are talking about almost 500 also. A large percentage of those are civilians, over 160 children included. These incursions, particularly in Karim, other than attacking infrastructure, involve also cutting water and electricity for prolonged periods of time. The main focus of attacks in Tulkarem in particular is the refugee camps, where we have two refugee camps, Tulkarem refugee camp and Nur Shams refugee camp, both of which host close to 30,000 people, or used to hold 30,000 people. But with the increased intensity of these attacks and the accumulative impact of the attacks against infrastructure, a lot of people who used to reside in refugee camps have sought temporary residence outside. They maybe try and maintain some sort of presence during the day, but as soon as there is news of a new Israeli incursion in the city, you will see lots of people fleeing for their temporary residence because it has become increasingly difficult for them to stay under curfew, let alone obviously the random house-to-house searches and mass arrests that are carried out. The incursions happen now at a frequency where even basic repairs of water infrastructure, electricity are not even completed. So even though the news about these attacks, they filter out somehow to the media while they're happening, but between these attacks, thousands of people are forced to live without the most basic necessities that they need.
One thing you emphasized and you've seen in those videos right there is the repeated attacks on infrastructure, on life infrastructure, water, electricity. There were videos of, D9 bulldozers tearing up roads. And, the interesting thing is, the Israelis have been prepping this narrative that they're going to escalate in the West Bank, and they of course are, by saying that they're conducting anti-terrorism operations, no different than they said in Gaza, we're just fighting terrorists, where now we clearly see there's, the Israelis are actively destroying all the life infrastructure and expelling Palestinians from Gaza. Do you think they're pursuing a similar style strategy in the West Bank?
Well, it's really difficult for me to comment on what's going on in Gaza, particularly with the attacks against journalists that have basically prevented us from seeing the full picture of what's going on there. But from the lived reality that we have here in Tulkarem, it's quite obvious that the main focus, the overall focus of these attacks is the collective punishment. Whether that collective punishment is pursuing specific practical goals or sending a message to the population in the West Bank that they are next, that the West Bank is not a safe place for them to be. That's up for discussion. But while it's perhaps wrong to deny that there is a certain level of resistance during these incursions, and part of these incursions target the insurgency, as they call it, local insurgency, I would say that the large majority of these acts are purposeful collective punishment and nothing else. In fact, if anything, if you want to weigh the impact or the overall impact of these incursions in Palestinian cities, you will find that there is more indirect recruitment for insurgency than there is counterinsurgency, in the sense where you take the basic infrastructure away from thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. You are forcing more people into desperate situation where they are more likely to pick up guns and try and resist. And with also the frequency and intensity of these attacks is definitely impacting a wider, almost purposefully, if not. This is not what the Israeli army would admit to, but this is what the observations suggest clearly. Then I think it's ridiculous that Israel is allowed to do this, and I think living through one incursion in Tulkarem can give you this message and erase any doubt, if anybody had any doubt about the underlying intentions of these incursions. For example, the incursions, as you mentioned, they include D9 and sometimes also D10 bulldozers, which are considerably bigger also. the incursion starts with the bulldozers ahead of the convoy. So any counterinsurgency operations would probably require at least some element of surprise, or you would think that the army would be more in a rush to reach the targeted areas, while basically every man and his dog can know that the army is advancing 40, maybe sometimes more than 40 minutes before they actually reach your area. There is, for example, nothing preventing the army from invading the city or raiding the city at a quicker pace and have the bulldozers arrive maybe later. But this is not the common practice here. So the only reason that Israel can get away with this sort of messaging is because international media likes to take the statements of the Israeli army at face value, despite the fact that it doesn't take much investigation to at least punch some holes in this argument. And when they rarely host and question Israeli officials about this, they never actually challenge the official narrative that they try and give out during these interviews.
Yeah, I think it's important just to clarify, as you have been saying, I mean, the whole idea here is Israel's destroying homes, pushing people off their land to take their land, just like Israel does everywhere else in Palestine. And obviously that creates people who resist that. And then it also becomes, quote unquote, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism to try to get rid of any resistance to land theft. And all that's to say, you talked about an increase in intensity. And something we've seen specifically this year in the West Bank has been airstrikes. And just last month in October, I think, early October, there was an airstrike on Tulkarem refugee camp that killed like 18 people. I mean, it was the sort of airstrike you see in Gaza or South Lebanon at this point. So I think it was really striking to see that take place in the West Bank because it was actually with a fighter jet. So I'm just curious if you can talk a bit about the significance of that level of intensity in terms of Israel's military campaign in the West Bank.
Right. We've seen the Israeli army use airstrikes in the West Bank using drones over the last 2 years. Actually, a couple of incidents took place before October 2023. But the use of drones has increased in frequency and intensity, of course, over the last year. But the strike that you mentioned, which killed at least 18 people in Tulkarem refugee camp, took place using a fighter jet, an F-16, according to media reports. And this was the first use of F-16 in the West Bank in over 20 years since the Second Intifada, as it's commonly known. But it also came after a public declaration by the Israeli army that when they announced wide-scale military operation in the north of the West Bank about a month and a half ago, or even more than that, it did refer to basically changing the rules of engagement and allowing for the use of the Air Force in a more free way for the Israeli army. These sort of attacks taking place inside a crowded refugee camp are obviously not just in violation to international law, but also reveal that the Israeli army is basically being pushed by the political apparatus in Israel to basically carry out more aggressive attacks against Palestinians.
Well, Anan Kuzmar, independent Tulkarem-based journalist and researcher, I want to thank you for joining us to break all of this down. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to having you back on soon.
Sure. Thank you very much.
So, wow, it's a dark view there. And I just want to clarify to everybody who's watching that this is all happening under a Democratic-led administration in the U.S. So, of course, there's a lot to be concerned about with this upcoming Trump administration, given who's in office. But I think we also have to remember that a lot of this is already happening.
Absolutely. And, we've been hearing the administration say for over a year, oh, this is just about fighting terrorism. Just let them, fight the terrorists, finish the job, whatever. And now you see them making incursions into the West Bank where there's no Hamas. They're going into Lebanon. It's just lie after lie after lie. And I think this next guest will illuminate some of Trump's further plans on some of these fronts.
Yes. And on that note, I would like to introduce to the show again Ashish Prashar. He's a political strategist and former advisor to the Middle East Peace Envoy. Ashish, welcome back to the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot has happened in just the last few days. It's been quite the whiplash. Every day we hear a few new Trump appointees. And I think, the question on everybody's mind is, with the people that we're seeing, whether it's Marco Rubio being tapped for Secretary of State or this Fox News host, is it Pete Hegseth? I don't even, his last name is weird. You can clarify that for me. Who's been tapped to be Secretary of Defense, who's basically like a Christian supremacist end timer who wants to build a third temple over the Al-Aqsa Mosque and literally bring about the end times. And a cast of other really disturbing characters, a former Dick Cheney advisor, and on and on and on. I guess walk us through some of these people and, at the end of the day, what does this mean? Let's start with for the Middle East.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting. I think one thing I'll take a step back for people who are anti-imperial, like the US invading every other country in the world, thinking it's an empire can tell us what to do. Nothing changes, right? This is the most important thing. A lot of these announcements are a distraction in the craziness of them, right? But the reality, policy doesn't really change, right? We had Bill Clinton call the West Bank Judea and Samaria, like the same way Mike Huckabee calls it Judea and Samaria. There is no belief system that is different. And anyone he probably would have picked from the Senate and Congress, bar Rashida Tlaib and maybe a couple of other progressives, would probably take the same line because most of them have AIPAC funding in some way, right? So they don't actually have that. The interesting thing also is the consistency of picks, right? So before we get into the foreign policy thing, people are outraged by this border czar, right? Tom Honan, right? But he was Barack Obama's border czar, and he was known as, deporter in chief, and he did such a good job of deporting people that Obama awarded him a medal, right? And that's the kind of person that people are outraged that Trump brought into office, forgetting or choosing to neglect the fact that he had already served Democrat presidents before him and had deported a mass amount of people. Now, with regards to the Middle East, right, take Marco Rubio. If he is officially put in as a Secretary of State role, because I feel like Trump's still playing games with him a little bit, and bullying him from the side by not really doing the big announcement the way he has done some of the other individuals he's put in his cabinet. But he is not going to change much that Secretary Blinken has done already, right? We have to remember, just because they don't have the same resumes, take the guy from Fox News, they don't have the same charm. Maybe Blinken plays the guitar better than Rubio and is more quote unquote likable. They still, these guys in office now are as much war criminals as the guys who are psychos coming in Trump's regime, right? Blinken's own grandfather founded the American Palestine Institute and furthered the Zionist colonial project in the Palestine. He was a warmonger before even being in office, right? So he championed the use of force over diplomacy, supported the illegal invasion of Iraq, supported NATO's military intervention in Libya, which is an intervention, which is an invasion, and deposing Gaddafi. And he argued that Obama failed in Syria because he did not use enough force to wipe out Assad's regime. That just because we have a guy with a Crusader tattoo doesn't mean their vision of the Middle East, their depravity in taking lives that are disposable to them is any different just because they play a guitar and have gone to the right schools. And I think people need to take a step back to remember that. Now, Rubio specifically, look, he's known for his anti-China policy. And that is really important, where I think where he thinks he'll have a lot of say. But also you have to consider the other caveat in this room, right? So Trump's transition team is made up of his chief of staff, Susie Wiltz. It's made up of Vance and I think Howard Lutnick. The other person in the room that not many people talk about in the mainstream media right now when they're announcing their outrage is Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk also makes a significant amount of his money from China and electric cars. Do you think someone in Trump's era is going to allow Trump, with all the rhetoric, I'm sure they're going to say things, they're going to say they're going to punish China, talk a good game like they do for a couple of years, but do you think anything's really going to change when one of the biggest investors in Trump's campaign, one of his biggest supporters, and someone, who is in his ear every day is going to allow Marco Rubio to set policy on that? I don't think so. Foreign policy will run through the Trump office and the Trump White House, and his close senior team, but it's not going to go. Marco Rubio is not going to have much say on a lot of that. The one danger area, I think you and me had a conversation offline, which was South America. Rubio will be given a lens to go after different parts of the world that maybe Donald Trump doesn't care about. And that's where he might show his muscle, so to speak. With regards to people like, the Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, the big worry for me is we have someone who is basically been groomed by a Hindu nationalist organization to hold our national secrets. It reminds me of British politics recently, where they had Suella Braverman in office and Priti Patel, who were both effectively agents of Israel at one point. Her husband, Suella Braverman, was a Zionist with West Bank property and served in the IDF. How could she be a genuine Home Secretary to the United Kingdom? And Priti Patel was also working for an Israeli tech company and a military contractor when they were in office. So all that doesn't surprise me that conservatives put in people that they don't really care about the intelligence part going to another country that might be equally anti-Islamic, shows that Islamophobia that we have running through our government here in the United States. On Iran, I don't see policy changing that much. Are we going to have a full-on war with Iran? If anything, it will be a tit-for-tat Israel being used as a proxy rather than the United States going all in. Trump, again, talks tough on it. And I do think consent is trying to be made with all these accusations that Iran had tried to assassinate him rather than lone American gunmen. But I don't know if Trump, at least immediately, wants to take on another war, because he's the guy who doesn't want to put American boots specifically on the ground anywhere. And he has talked already about taking American resources out of the Middle East in some other way.
Yeah, his administration, or the cabinet picks he's making, definitely seem to be intended to send messages to, different countries, China and, Iran, as you mentioned. Obviously, the other one is Israel. And, one of the big topics that's come up is, obviously people in Israel, Israeli officials are celebrating this. And there's been talk that Trump is going to try to bring back the so-called deal of the century, this so-called peace plan for the Middle East. Can you describe to our viewers, what that is, what the significance of that proposed deal was, and what you think might happen on that front?
Right. So the interesting thing for me is, again, it goes back to how there's a consistent thread here and stuff that Biden didn't suddenly overturn because he came into office. Since Donald Trump has won this election, it's been predicted his administration will be far worse than Palestine, far worse for the Middle East. His pro-Israel rhetoric and threats to bomb Iran and his foreign policy rants at his speeches. But if you look closer, it doesn't differ much, right? It goes that just because Biden administration was in office, they continued his policies of the Trump presidency. Although there may be surprises in who they put in these roles, or anger that there are raging Zionists in Israel. Again, I go back to Secretary Blinken is a raging Zionist. Just because we have some others that are more outspoken and say it more craftily doesn't make it any different, right? So Biden in his term maintained a lot of Trump's policies, right? Specifically, think about the one that everyone, and you've heard on the campaign talk about. They've compared Biden's genocide to Trump moving the embassy to Tel Aviv, right? From Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, almost accepting Israel's annexation of the Palestinian territories and encouraging more expansion of the illegal settlements. Look, Trump administration offered, economic support in exchange for giving up the political rights to self-determination. That's not going to be taken there, right? While the Biden administration don't say that, their backing of a two-state solution was nothing over this whole 4 years. Even up till October 7th last year, as I think one of your previous guests mentioned, there was attacks on the West Bank, attacks on Palestinian communities, settlements popping up left, right, and center, and the Biden administration did nothing. They only have to start talking about it is when Gaza exploded, right? That's when they had to start saying, oh, we're going to sanction some people who are doing these horrific crimes in the West Bank. But they didn't really ever change the Trump administration's like not so discreet annexation of the West Bank. Now, Biden didn't close the embassy in Jerusalem. And furthermore, the Biden administration accepted the idea that the future Palestinian state would not enjoy full rights of self-determination or sovereignty. And we know that because Biden administration held the position that Palestinian statehood could only come through direct negotiation between the parties. But Israel refused to ever change its policy, its law, to never accept a Palestinian state, basically, through his entire administration. And the second element is on the Trump-Biden similarities is those Abraham Accords that you're talking about. The first Trump administration initiated a path to normalization with, Morocco, the UAE, Bahrain. The Biden administration vigorously pursued the same path with efforts to normalize Israel and Saudi Arabia. They still are pushing that today as we speak while a genocide is happening. And MBS is always having to make a statement, whether we believe him or not, that he's not going to do this right now because there's an ongoing genocide. But they've been pushing this through this genocide. And based on Trump's proclamations during his campaign and his advisors, donors, and supporters, he'll continue to push that as Abraham Accords, basically connecting these countries economically, making sure that they guarantee Palestinian security for better trading and economic rights with not just Israel, but like the United States itself. Now that is dangerous because it inoculates the Middle East. It inoculates any resistance effectively to in support of the resistance on the ground, protecting Palestinian people. And you can see that when you're seeing people beg their leaders in their countries right now, from Morocco to Egypt to everywhere else, going, why are you not doing anything to protect, our kin? They've done that job with the Abraham Accords, and I expect the Trump administration to continue to do that, to further inoculate the Middle East right now.
It's interesting because it really does seem like this is the best cabinet Miriam Adelson could possibly pay for or buy.
Yeah.
In many ways. I'm curious if I could ask you, Ashish, about the domestic front, because there's also a lot of concern about what this means for pro-Palestine protesters. I mean, just a couple of days ago, there was a bill in Congress that didn't pass, luckily, but it was intended essentially to give the president the power to strip any nonprofit of its nonprofit status, essentially bankrupting it if the president decides it supports terrorism, which is like a completely vague thing. And obviously is just giving somebody like dictatorial powers to eliminate their political opposition. And 52 Democrats voted to give Trump those powers. And that's something I think we're going to see more of an attempt of. And I mean, I know someone like Elise Stefanik, who's been appointed to UN ambassador, isn't necessarily going to be having influence over legislation in Congress if she's going to be at the UN. But I mean, she was rewarded for basically going after university presidents and calling everybody anti-Semitic last year. And then now you have Matt Gaetz promoted to Attorney General. I'm not sure, people have different ideas of what his position might be on that. So anyways, given this kind of cast of pro-Israel characters, what do you think that might mean for groups who are pushing back and resisting against the U.S. empire from inside the belly of the beast?
Well, it's really interesting because I think a lot of people will say that a lot of that has started to happen under Biden, right? Already, right? We had the student demonstrations, and there's been one public story, I think, of a student in Cornell who had nearly his visa revoked because Cornell wanted to kick him out, and they were leaving him in the hands of the State Department, effectively, which would have been his deportation. But there have been so many cases behind the scenes of students who participated in peaceful demonstrations on college campuses, reading books and educating themselves on Palestine, who are from different countries, who've not been allowed back, who've not got that media attention, and probably not wanted to get that media attention, frankly, because they're still trying to appeal their visa. The US policy on effectively, not just the Muslim ban, but anyone who participated in these protests is already happening under Secretary Blinken, who's not his State Department is just not renewing people's visas if they've spoken up about Palestine. That is already in effect. Now, whether they pass a big public thing to attack charities, I think most of the protests are decentralized already. I think a lot of people who are on the streets are part of organizations, yes, but they're not all registered charities. There are amazing charities in the United States that are pro-Palestinian and supportive of the Palestinian movement. And obviously they would be impacted by that. But I think we're already operating under the guise that the police are going to come down heavy on people protesting on behalf of Palestinians. We're already operating under the guise that, they're going to use everything possible to threaten people from turning up on the streets, right? If you are on a visa, your life already is at risk, right? People have been reporting people who are like on visas who protested in this under the Biden administration. So they would be, if they got arrested, their visa might be revoked through the last year, right? People have been using billionaires in our country, like black men have been exposing people so their lives would be hell already and using the police state. That we'll never forget those images from Colombia where NYPD used almost effectively an anti-terror unit to go in there and drag students out, discharging a weapon on site, which never got investigated, with police having things on their phones that have been photographed by credible journalists in the United States who basically said, oh, I hope I kill someone tonight. This is literally what we are living with right now. What Trump is just, what Congress is effectively trying to do is make it acceptable. That's, maybe quell any doubt that this is going to happen if you step out of line. And, it goes back to the point that this duopoly that we live with these two parties, there is one single party. Only America does it really well by having two. So you can pick one and choose which one, depending on how you feel every 4 years. That's what we're seeing domestically. Going back about the Miriam Edelson thing, she couldn't have dreamed for a better cabinet, right? They will annex the West Bank. Like, let's just be straight. Trump's not his intent is clear. He's going to annex the West Bank. But the reality is they're annexing it. They've been annexing it, as you know, for the last 8, 10, 12 years. And no president, Democrat or Republican, has really done anything about it. They've kind of let it happen behind the scenes. All Trump does is hold a mirror up to America. So actually, this is who we really are. You don't like the pics that are just saying all this stuff out loud, but this is who we really are. We are annexing. We just say things like two-state solution. His State Department and his defense team will just basically stop the gaslighting part of like, we believe in two states and Palestinians' right to self-determination. And what that could open up really is like, it would, for me, watching, what I know through my time in the Middle East envoy's office is, it might lead to finally the toppling of someone like Abbas, who has basically been holding back his people from resisting with the security service, the Israeli attempts to throw them out of their land, their homes. Now, once he's gone, maybe there'll be a full-on resistance that will allow to, thrive, frankly, to resist the Israeli occupation of their land, that will resist the removal of their children from their homes at night. And that is potentially one weird silver lining that will stop the pretense that America actually gives a damn about Palestinians through policy and will actually get into what this actually is. Like, this is a full-on occupation. This is a full-on settler colonial project. It has no desire to see a Palestinian in that territory, which would mean everybody can actually pick up a gun and fight if that's what they choose to want to do, or resist in any other means. And maybe people who have been, following the American line, maybe in Europe, and I think we've mentioned this in the past, where they just need America to keep saying two-state solution because their actual public is genuinely, I think if you look at what's happening in France and England and Spain and Italy, we're seeing the mass resistance to, stocking Israeli ships, to weapons transfers and everything else. Their public's, only thing that's holding them back is their government keep talking about a two-state solution. Now, if Trump throws that completely out the window, you might see a separation of this European-American hegemony over the Middle East, right? They're going to have to somehow answer that. Now, either they change sides effectively and say we need to defend Palestinians' right to exist in a territory and go head-to-head with America, which I don't believe all of them will be. But a lot of the southern states that have already positioned themselves with arms embargoes might just say, hey, we're done with this. Ireland, countries like that will be done with this. Maybe even France. The UK, I imagine, would follow the US path on this because they just literally do whatever the United States wants. But you're going to see some massive division, which also could jeopardize NATO, which, as you know, has never been Trump's favorite organization in the first place. So there is massive repercussions to the annexation of the West Bank that could ripple through European and international global organizations that America leads policy that could actually open doors for potentially a liberated Palestine through the chaos that it might cause.
Wow. Well, that is a lot. That's important to recognize that, in fact, a lot of the things we're so terrified of happening under Trump are already happening, which shows you what a dark world we're in. Ashish, I want to thank you for coming on and breaking all that down for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, okay, I think those are all really good points. I mean, it really puts things in perspective, not to mean that, it's not going to be harsh under the Trump administration or hard, but it really is important to recognize that while these people who are in charge under Democrats are talking about human rights, they're doing everything that the Trump cabinet is saying they want to do. they just are saying it out loud. And so it is important to keep that in mind, because while there is a lot of doom and gloom ahead of us, we don't want to like fall into despair or helplessness over it, because it's all already happening. All that's to say, let's keep moving on here, because we have another very important guest joining us, our very own Dr. Ben Becker. He is the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News. Ben Becker, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we are having you on to talk about Trump's deportation plan. And, you know, we have some figures that are being appointed that are quite terrifying and have really, really, really bad ideas for how to deal with immigrants, which is just basically this horrific mass deportation plan. And of course, none of that addresses any of the reasons for immigration, which is, you know, sanctions regimes and constant imperialist wars and just destruction of economies. So I guess let's start with, before we get into that, can you like lay out what should we expect under Trump? Who has he appointed and why should we be concerned?
Well, he's appointed some of the most hard right, ultra right, anti-immigrant figures you can possibly imagine. They're not unknown figures totally, like Holman, who will be the new border czar. He served previously under the first Trump administration, but actually has a long career, including under the Obama administration and even before that. So this is a guy who, when you hear his speeches, I mean, he's swearing at immigrants. He's saying, pack your bags, look over your shoulder. He's saying things like, we don't have to separate families when we do deportations. We'll just deport the whole family. I mean, he's basically, his message during the campaign and all the campaign rallies, he's saying exactly what they're going to do, which is mass deportations. If you remember at the RNC this year, they actually printed out signs that said mass deportations now. So it's become a actual rallying call, similar to Build the Wall in 2016. This is sort of the newest iteration of it. But this one, of course, has an even more dramatic and immediate human impact. While a wall might take years to be built and might not ever be built in full, they can start going after undocumented immigrants right away. And basically what they're promising is day one, the mass deportations will begin. They're promising executive actions that will eliminate protected status, temporary protected status, TPS, for wide swaths of people. It could be up to 1 million people. They say they're going to do mass deportations for all undocumented. Some people say that. Others say they're going to go after just the criminals. But it's likely that Trump, for instance, would change what are kind of the priority enforcement. So Biden says go after serious criminals for deportation, whereas Trump will say anybody charged with a felony, or maybe anyone at all. And I think in all these, these differences do matter, but the main thing is that they're going to unleash ICE and the Department of Homeland Security to basically go to war with the immigrant community. And if you've ever seen sort of how these raids work, they basically go into a house and often they will say anybody who's there, whether or not they've ever faced any charge, they could be working at a hotel or a local deli, have no criminal record at all, could have a family they're providing for. If they're there and ICE can't identify them as someone who has the legal status, they'll be taken in as, quote, collateral, and will just be put in the van and sent home. So they're going to have a rapid escalation of detention centers. I think that it is going to happen. I don't think it was just a sort of a campaign rhetoric. I think they have every intention, and this appointment shows it, to start carrying out mass deportations on day one. It won't be the first time in U.S. history something like this has happened, but it'll be the first time in quite a while. So I think it's going to be very dramatic, and we shouldn't sort of bat our eyes at it or hope that if we don't pay attention, it won't happen. This is coming, and I think it's going to happen in a lot of workplaces in particular.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about this issue that you alluded to is how the Trump campaign has really turned this into a rallying cry, whether it was Build the Wall or mass deportations. It feels almost like a release valve. Americans are getting hit so hard with inflation. People are struggling to make it, living paycheck to paycheck and all this. And really, like, the proposition or the sort of thing that people are being told is, oh, if we get, immigrants out, like somehow things will be better. But it really feels like a way, because Trump is not really bringing forward any grand vision of building anything or building an economic program or anything like that. His main proposal is like, oh, we're going to get rid of some people. What do you have to say? Because you said this is not the first time this has happened. How do you feel about this being used as a sort of like economic red meat, or sort of to sort of speak to people who are struggling right now? And what is the history of this being used as a sort of like a scapegoat issue?
To go through the whole history, we need a lot of time, because there is a long, long history of the kind of xenophobic, nativistic scapegoating. All throughout, it's especially pronounced in periods of economic crisis, where the ruling class essentially wants to deflect anger. You can see Trump doing it when he talks about crime. There's enough undocumented immigrants. You can, if you want to go and you have a whole agency like you did last time, to basically just find any undocumented immigrant who's committed a crime and then make that a sensational news story. And you do that every single day for years. You build a perception that undocumented immigrants are more prone to violent crime than other people, even though it's not true. But the data be damned, you can still create the perception. The same even when like people were complaining about rent being too high, and they said, what are you going to do about the rent being too high? A very bread and butter issue that lots of people in the working class care about as their number one issue, given the number of people who are spending 30 to 50% of their income on rent. Or people say they can't afford a house. He says, well, I'm going to pass a law to make it illegal for an undocumented immigrant to take out a mortgage. Now, the percentage of undocumented immigrants that are taking out mortgages is like so small. It's having no impact at all on home prices. I mean, the real enemy in that would be like BlackRock and these big hedge funds that are buying up whole towns. But Trump's not going to agitate against BlackRock. He's going to agitate against the undocumented families that have usually pooled their resources to buy one home, and and they're doing it to live in pretty difficult conditions often. So it is very classic scapegoating. There's a long history of it. In the 1930s, in the U.S. during the Great Depression, they had something called the repatriation program that was carried out under both Republican and Democratic administrations, and they sent upwards to over a million Mexicans back to Mexico. They said repatriating voluntarily, but often they were just picking up anybody who was speaking Spanish or looked Mexican, including many U.S. citizens, and sent them back. Of course, this created a big labor shortage, and then they had to initiate a guest worker program because someone's got to pick all the food. During this whole period, mind you, and this is kind of interesting, most people don't know about U.S. history, up until 1965, there was no numerical restriction whatsoever on the number of immigrants who could come from the Western Hemisphere into the United States. So a lot of these immigration restrictions, especially on Latin America, are fairly novel, dating back to the 1960s. It also coincided with the termination of these guest worker programs in 1964. So the fact is that the United States has really always had a dependence on migrant labor in one form or another, especially in agriculture, but now you can find it in construction, you can find it in the hotels, in childcare. You have whole sections of the economy that would potentially collapse if there was a full-scale deportation of like 12 million undocumented immigrants. And it would also cost hundreds of billions of dollars to carry out this many deportations. And ultimately, when you look through the history of it, it doesn't lead to higher wages, or rent doesn't come down. Unions don't go stronger. Quite the contrary. Actually, these sort of mass deportation and anti-immigrant hysterias, all they end up doing is really strengthening capital. They allow people to be divided, the workers to be divided against each other. It creates a sense of terror in many workplaces. So I think organized labor in particular, which used to be anti-immigrant, and then basically changed in the 1970s and 80s to realizing, look, immigrants are coming here no matter what. And so the question is, are we going to organize them alongside citizen workers to fight for basically a common wages, common benefits, a common standard, and basically refusing to be divided against each other. This was a historic turn that organized labor made, which I think is going to be very important in the coming phase, because ultimately we need voices like that coming out and saying it's impossible to basically get rid of all immigrants. So the question is, we're here, we're living together, we're in the same neighborhoods. Are we going to fight against our common enemy? Don't allow ourselves to be divided.
One last thing I'd love for you to touch on, Ben, because I think it's really important to always keep this at the, somewhat forefront when we talk about the issue of immigration, is we can't forget why people come here. Everything you said is totally important about the economy and the fact that, these people, undocumented immigrants, actually do a lot of really important work for practically slave wages, which is horrific. It's not like they're taking jobs that anybody else will do, especially for almost no money. But that said, people are leaving desperate circumstances. Lots of times, not always, but a lot of times it's because of U.S. policy. So I'm just curious if you could run through that real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. If you were to put out a graph, for instance, of the big migratory surges of the last 10 years, whether it be from Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Cuba, you would find the direct imprint of U.S. foreign policy, intervention, sanctions, blockades, basically making lives miserable for people. And then, of course, people leave. And where are they going to go? They're going to often go to the country that has a higher wage, that has more money in it, where you can sort of find some way to scrape by. A lot of these countries, even the ones that haven't been the victims of direct military intervention, like Mexico itself, they've had so much economic devastation as a result of U.S. imposed neoliberal policies. So much value has been extracted from these countries and basically repatriated or sent back to, exported back to the United States. So in a way, you can think of the migrants chasing the value that has been stolen from their home economies back to the empire itself, where then they often send remittances back to their families to pay for them because they can't survive in their home countries. And, it's so important to underscore this, Rania. I mean, immigration has always been highly politicized. For a long time, the only way you could even get refugee status is if you were a victim of communism. The idea of political persecution in general was actually fairly new. It was basically always been a politicized category. It was a way of really drawing people out of China and the Soviet Union and Cuba. Those are the only people who ever got sort of immediate refugee status. But if you were from another country that was attacked by the United States, or there was a friend of the United States, you wouldn't ever get refugee status. So it's always been highly politicized. But look at Venezuela now. Look at Cuba now. I mean, these countries have been thoroughly blockaded. So of course, people are going to come and try to make a living. So how can Marco Rubio or Trump or any of these people, basically say they're going to build a wall, they're going to deport millions of people? They're actually creating the migratory crisis themselves, or the migratory waves themselves. Trump himself, very interesting. I found this right before coming on the show. One of his last acts before he went out in 2021, in January 2021, right around January 6th, he extended the temporary protective status for over 100,000 Venezuelans in the United States because they were, in his view, like a right-wing exile base that was supporting him. So he actually extended TPS to over 100,000 Venezuelans so that they could stay here longer. But then, as the impact of the blockade had a bigger and bigger role, and Venezuelans in general started to come, then it became, these Venezuelans, right? So there's contradictions everywhere. And the main way, if you want to basically try to slow down the global migratory wave, which is over a huge number of people across the world, it's not just the United States, it's Africa, it's the Middle East, it's Asia. People are leaving because of environmental crisis, economic crisis. You have to address the roots of migration. And basically, you can't do that under an imperialist framework where all the value of the world is being concentrated in a few Western countries. You have to allow these countries to develop freely, develop with sovereignty, allow them to have political processes that are liberatory. If people had hope in their home countries, a large number of them would prefer to stay in their home countries rather than come to the United States and be subjected to low wages, disrespect, being vilified and demonized on the news 24/7, living, having to look over your shoulder, living in the shadows. Nobody really wants that. People would prefer to have a dignified life in their homeland, but actually it's the U.S. empire that's preventing it.
So important to understand it that way. Dr. Ben Becker, the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, it's funny, Kay, before we move on to the next story, I can't tell you the amount of times I meet people who have immigrated to the U.S., often taxi drivers who are like, I made the biggest mistake ever. This country's the worst. I can't save any money. Everything costs too much. It sucks. And the whole idea is American dream's actually a nightmare. And then it's always, they lied to us. And you're just like, I mean,
No, it's amazing. I was watching the Tom Homan 60 Minutes interview before this, and like the interviewer was like, so you're talking about deploying tens of thousands of federal agents into different communities around the country, rounding people up. Their estimates that this will cost like $80 billion. And like, I was just thinking to myself this morning, like, it's just astounding that is like the best this country can do is like, they can't send tens of thousands of people into neighborhoods to like find which ones are food insecure and like, plant food and like build gardens for them. They can't send thousands of people into different neighborhoods to find which ones houses are dilapidated, but they can send these sort of Gestapo-like agents to round people up and send them, back to the countries that we destroyed.
American dream. American dream.
American dream, right, exactly.
Yeah. American dream. Well, on that note, we're going to move on to our next story here. I would like to welcome to the show Lea Kayali, an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement and their Mask Off Maersk campaign. Lea, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, we're really excited to talk about this because this is actually like a bright light. So much doom and gloom, so much bad news all the time. And actually, your campaign has been having some successes. The Mask Off Maersk campaign. Spain has actually agreed to block Maersk's ships going to Israel after the Palestinian Youth Movement exposed that they were violating Spain's arms embargo. So let's start with this. Can you tell us what is Maersk? It's such a weird name. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. I always say it wrong. What is Maersk? What is this campaign? Why should we care?
Rania, we used to joke like the first goal of the campaign is to figure out if it's Maersk, like how do we say it? Either way, they are a shipping and logistics giant that folks might not have heard of, but is actually one of the most profitable corporations on earth. Maersk is not only a shipping and logistics giant, but it's actually one of Israel's main partners in genocide. And that's why in the spring of this year, the Palestinian Youth Movement launched our campaign, Mask Off Maersk, because we know that Maersk is one of the corporations most complicit in the slaughter of our people in Palestine and Gaza. We knew that Maersk was connected to the U.S. Navy through their maritime securities program. We knew that Maersk was shipping 300 million plus amount of weapons to the likes of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Elbit Systems. But what our recent research, as you mentioned, was able to expose was the particular commercial lines that Maersk operates to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So what we uncovered was that over 2,100 shipments in just the last year have gone on Maersk commercial ships to the Israeli Ministry of Defense carrying military cargo. And of those, we found that over 900 of them were flouting the Spanish arms embargo that was launched in May of this year. And so when we published that information, Spain had to, was sort of forced to respond, and progressive and left forces within Spain ensured that their government, didn't get away with flouting the arms embargo through Maersk. And so that sent this, multinational, tens of billions of dollar profit company scrambling through the Mediterranean, trying to figure out how to get this military cargo to Israel. And so when we talk about, launching a people's arms embargo, that's why we're targeting Maersk. This is a company that is a merchant of death, a supply line that connects all of the weapons manufacturers you've heard about to Israel to be able to enact the genocide on our people.
One of the things that I think this campaign has revealed and, takes place in the context of, I think, many different campaigns, whether it be like school divestment campaigns, BDS, and people taking on personal boycotts, of just how intertwined and how there's this just massive web of complicity in the Israeli occupation and genocide. So, hats off to you for the research. And by the way, there's a full report with all the different cargo ships and like all the different weights and everything. All the information is out there. But I guess my question to you is, what should people's takeaway be from this? Like, you're hearing, okay, Maersk, I think a lot of people have probably seen the logos in like shipyards or whatever, maybe. But like, what is the takeaway? Like, now that we know the world's biggest shipping giant is like complicit in genocide, what should people think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Kay. I think what people should take away from that is that they should feel empowered to actually target this company directly, right? I mean, for a year, I'm Palestinian. I've been watching my people in Gaza emerge from the rubble, dignified with their fists held high, but demanding, where is the world? And for a year, people have been flooding the streets, trying to pressure their governments to sanction Israel, to cut off arms to Israel, to take action against the genocide. But as we know, Western imperialist countries, with the US being the head of the snake, have taken no action because they are partners in genocide. So when we talk about Maersk and we talk about the gains of this campaign, I think it should, show people that we have an opening to actually enact the change we want to see ourselves. As organized people around the world, we can cut off the supply line to genocide. We just have to be organized in the right way, targeting the right companies. And this campaign, I think, is one opportunity to do that.
Yeah, it certainly requires getting creative because this genocide has gone on for over a year. And it's just, I think, shocked us all because nobody expected this to continue for so long. And I think so much of the world to do so little to stop it. So I think a campaign like this is so unbelievably important. And then I guess my question becomes, who's next? Because this is a massive shipping company. Thank you to our Spanish comrades for abiding by this arms embargo. And I'm sure there's maybe other things they can be doing as well. But then, where do we go from here with Maersk? Like what other arms embargoes exist where we can actually get this to be implemented in other countries if possible? Or are there other companies on the horizon that are going to be targeted in this way?
So with regards to Maersk, we know that they're a capital seeking corporation. They're just going to chase profits. And so the goal here is really to change that profit equation for us as organized people to pull Maersk away from the death machine that it is intertwined with. And so in order to do that, we can use these openings like the Spanish arms embargo. But really the great thing about Maersk as a target is that Maersk is everywhere. This is a company, as Kay mentioned, that you may have seen on your highways, in your ports. And the next step for the campaign is really to meet it everywhere it is, and to say that you will not get to traverse our roads and our waters while you remain complicit in a genocide. We saw Moroccan comrades actually take to the streets immediately as soon as it was announced that those complicit ships that were prevented from docking in Spain were actually going to dock in the port of Tangiers in Morocco. So this momentum is already building, and it will only continue to build. We're asking folks to flood the phone lines and the email lines of Maersk complicit officials, but that is just the first step. I mean, this is really a crack in the armor of empire. And so we need to be the wedge that continues to force it open, and we can only do that through sustained pressure against a target like Maersk.
One of the things that really gets me about this campaign is it is a fantastic campaign, but it's this is really the job of international bodies. This is really it's the United Nations that's supposed to be enforcing something like this, and they have a mandate to. There was a UN resolution that was passed. I think it was it was 124 to 14 or something was the vote, calling for an arms embargo against Israel, but it's not being enforced. And thankfully, thanks to organizers like yourself, it's being enforced in countries like Spain. But I guess my question to you is there needs to be, you're saying, this sort of systemic adoption of this policy. So, I guess, what does that look like, or what really needs to happen on an international level for this genocide to end and for Israel to be held accountable for its crimes?
Right. I mean, There are myriad ways that Maersk should already be held accountable for their complicity in genocide, like you said. I mean, all states are under obligations under international humanitarian law. Corporate officers within those states should be held accountable through them. They can also be held accountable in the International Criminal Court. I mean, it's not just Netanyahu and Gallant that should be brought in, but it's all of these, officials in countries and companies that are making this genocide possible. But the sad reality is that is not going to happen until the tidal wave of people power forces it to happen. Because as of now, I think we have been beyond dismayed by not only, of course, the imperialist countries like the US, but also the international institutions that are supposed to stand up for the global South in moments like this. And the sad reality is that hasn't happened, and I don't think it will happen until the people force that question. And so ultimately the strategy here is to force continued confrontation with the fact that companies like Maersk are complicit in genocide. There is no hiding or whitewashing from the truth that we've been able to uncover in this recent report, and also, in our months-long campaign. And we will not let them hide from this so long as there are people that want to stand on the right side of history.
And on that note, I want to ask you, because, people always say to me, oh my gosh, I just don't know what to do. Like, this genocide's so awful. I don't know what to do. And I always say, you got to get involved in organizations that are doing things collectively. So as somebody who is a part of an organization that is doing something collectively, how do you respond to that question of me as an individual, whether I'm on DC or LA or some middle part of the country, because apparently I only think DC and LA exist in America. I don't know why only those came to mind, but wherever somebody might be in this empire, what can they as individuals do to get involved in these sort of collective campaigns, whether it's Palestinian Youth Movement or others?
I mean, look, I'm from the Midwest originally, and we've got organizers there too. But I think that's a great question, right? Like, what we've realized is that people, the masses of people around the world have their hearts in the right place. They stand with the people of Palestine, and they know what's happening is wrong. And in fact, I think that's fundamentally the strength of our movement. Our masses of people and the bravery of our people in the movement are really the two things we have over our enemies. And so we can really only tap into the potential of the popularity of this struggle by getting organized. So, if you're someone out there who has felt left high and dry by the failed US electoral process, if you're someone who feels like you are asking the same questions as our family and friends in Gaza are when they say, where is the world? The answer is really we need to start looking beside ourselves and not up to the people in power, right? We have to start banding together and getting organized if we want to enact real material change to prevent this genocide from continuing any longer. And one way to do that is by joining an organization, get involved with folks who are prioritizing movements and campaigns like this in your locale. I mean, as the Palestinian Youth Movement, we've got chapters around North America, Britain, and Italy. Check us out if you're in a city where we've got one. But, there are people of conscience getting organized everywhere. So it's just a matter of finding your people, choosing a campaign that is strategic and winnable, and moving towards it and getting organized. Like I said, this is, I really think folks should see these developments around the Spanish arms embargo and Maersk's scramble to get around our exposing of them as an example of what opportunities wait for us if we just are organized enough to make them happen.
Well, Lea Kayali, an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement and their Mask Off Maersk campaign, congratulations on this win. I hope to see more of them. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Great speaking with you.
Well, that is such a lovely, positive story to hear, because, sometimes it really does get very doom and gloom. And I feel like the next story we're going to be covering, Kei, unless you have anything you want to add about that.
No, I mean, just it really is incredible, that this PYM Progressive International investigation has sort of brought the Spanish government to its knees, not quite to its knees, but it is impressive. It really it really shows the high horizon of like what is possible, and it's like it might sound corny, but it's like without the belief that we can do these things, like we will never try them. But we live in unprecedented times on many fronts, but while it might feel doom and gloom at the same time, this is just a really great reminder of what millions of people can do when they're in motion.
Exactly. And on that note, let's go ahead and introduce our next guest, Zachary Foster. He's a historian of Palestine. Zachary, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we have an interesting story to talk about here because last week was an insane, almost like experiment in propaganda when we saw, I'm just going to tell you the mainstream version of it, Zachary, and then you can tell me what actually happened. So for those who were, who were reading the New York Times or the Washington Post or just Israeli media, there were 1940s style or 1930s style pogroms in Amsterdam against innocent Israeli Jews who were just, hanging out in Amsterdam to cheer on their soccer team, and just hordes of barbaric, brown people in Amsterdam came for them in these horrific anti-Semitic riots and beat people up. And it's just, like Kristallnacht all over again. Can you tell us what reality was like in relation to what I just said?
Well, the mainstream media was correct that there was, in fact, a pogrom committed in Amsterdam, but they just mixed up who was the perpetrator of the pogrom and who was the victim. In fact, the perpetrator of the pogrom were the Israeli hooligans who, the night before this soccer match, went around the central area, central and western areas of Amsterdam, ripping out Palestinian flags from homes, menacing bystanders. We have reports that they threw beer cans on people. They were breaking windows of people's homes, chanting "Death to the Arabs," "May your village burn." These are familiar slogans to those who follow Israeli protests. These are very commonly heard slogans. You'll hear it, for example, on Jerusalem Day, also known as Apartheid Day, that was celebrated this past spring. We also heard chants such as, "There is no school in Gaza because all of the children are dead." These are Israeli hooligans rampaging around the city of Amsterdam the night before the soccer match. And then during the soccer match itself, those same hooligans disrupted a 1-minute silence for the flood victims of the flood that ravaged Valencia, Spain, in part apparently because the Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez urged countries around the world to stop selling arms to Israel. After the match, and by the way, just so folks can access the reports themselves, the footage we have from the Dutch YouTuber Bender, a 16-year-old Dutch YouTuber, is one of the most is really one of the only journalists who was actually on the ground witnessing, who bore witness to these scenes. And you can access that YouTube channel. It's a 15-minute video where you can see all this footage. You also have footage taken by Annette de Graaf, who is another citizen journalist, a Dutch journalist in Amsterdam, who also has footage from the incident. And so after the game itself, that those same Israeli hooligans, by the way, many of whom are themselves reservists in Israel's army, the same army that is currently carrying out a genocide in Gaza. So those same hooligans, Israeli army reservists, they start to uproot, they start to grab metal pipes from construction zones, they grab metal sticks, they grab smoke bombs, they threw, it's unclear exactly what, but they threw an object at a police car. So we have violence carried out by the Israeli hooligans against the Dutch police. Then they go around the city, apparently looking for anyone who's Muslim or who appears to be of Arab descent, attacking them. They attacked a taxi driver, desperately looking for a fight. And lo and behold, there was resistance, and there were many apparently young Muslim, primarily apparently from Moroccan backgrounds, Dutch citizens who fought back. And some 5 or 10 Israelis wound up hospitalized, all of whom have since been released. But that is the story. The story was the pogrom was carried out by the Israeli hooligans against the people of Holland. And I just want to emphasize one last point, which is that it's not uncommon to see violence and riots break out after these kinds of soccer matches, hooligans are infamous for the violence that they often perpetrate before, and after these types of matches. But this was very different. This was the hooligans not attacking the opposing team's fans, which is usually what happens. These were hooligans going after, seeking out Arab and Muslim locals, people who had nothing to do with the match, just innocent bystanders, and attacking them. And that's the story.
Yeah, I didn't even know some of those details about how they were like explicitly targeting Muslim people in Amsterdam. Just really gets worse and worse. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this is how this was almost like a gift to the Zionist forces, or at least when the news started breaking, Zionists rushed to it, and they said, "Oh, look at this pogrom happening in Amsterdam." They really wanted to bring a lot of attention to it, and then when the details started coming out, they are completely silent. I saw this Zionist I know from my hometown share this image on social media that said, "This is why I feel like there needs to be a state of Israel. This is why I feel unsafe as a Jew in the world." No, I mean, you can't make this up. And like, I guess, there is this history, and I want you to speak to this. There's this history of Israel using, perceived anti-Semitism, or that anti-Semitism benefits them in that it drives this sort of mentality that there needs to be a Jewish state, or it drives more Jews to Israel. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's exactly correct. From its origins in the late 19th century, the greatest allies to the Zionists were the anti-Semites themselves. We have countless cases of the leading anti-Semites in Europe, including the person who coined the term anti-Semitism, was a raging Zionist. Istotsky, who was a Hungarian politician, he also in 1878 in the Hungarian parliament called for a Jewish state in Palestine. The most infamous non-Jewish Zionist of all, Arthur Balfour, was also a raging Zionist who prevented Jews from entering Britain in 1905 as they were being slaughtered in the masses in Eastern Europe, but then, of course, called for a Jewish state in Palestine in the infamous Balfour Declaration of 1917. And, of course, this alliance between the Zionists and the anti-Semites continues well into the 1930s, when, in the aftermath of Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Jews around the world were horrified, and there was almost a spontaneous boycott of Nazi Germany. And the German official Göring called the German Jews in for a meeting, who all said, "No, we're not going to call an end to this boycott," except the one a Jew in Germany who was willing to call for an end to the boycott, of course, was, guess who? It was the leader of the Zionist community in Germany, who was happy to ally with the Zionists because they had shared goals. The Nazis wanted to rid Germany of the Jews, and the Zionists also wanted the German Jews to move to Palestine, so they had shared goals. And obviously, this story carries through all the way to the present day, where you even have people like John Hagen, the founder of Christians United for Israel, a 10 million person strong organization, the largest Christian Zionist organization in the United States today. In his book that he published in the early 2000s, he actually blames the Jews for the rise of Hitler, and himself basically says it was the fault of the Jews that they got slaughtered in the millions during the Nazi Holocaust. So there's nothing new about this alliance, this unity between Zionists and anti-Semites. And just one final point I would make: in the aftermath of the Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, we have countless incidents of what I call manufactured anti-Semitism. These are incidents on college campuses. We had one at Yale, we had one at MIT, we had one at Columbia, about 6 of them that I've been able to document, in which Zionists are basically almost trying to manufacture an anti-Semitic incident. In one case in Colombia, it appears as if someone is basically pretending to be some kind of pro-Palestine person calling for supporting Hamas, even though it's very obvious this is basically an undercover Zionist agent. And so we have many, many other cases like this. And again, it's for the same reason that Zionists need anti-Semitism. That's the whole reason why Zionism needs to exist, because anti-Semitism persists, always will persist, always has and always will. It's sort of, if you're a Zionist, there are 3 laws of the universe. There's sort of gravity, mitochondrial DNA, and anti-Semitism.
I mean, someone comes to mind, Columbia professor Shai Davidai, who I saw attack you recently, Zachary. And he's somebody who's just constantly manufacturing anti-Semitism, but I think he actually does believe that if you oppose Israel's right to kill babies, it's actually anti-Semitism. I guess I want to ask you a bit about the psychology here, because I don't know if people know they're making it up, or if they genuinely are so used to impunity and being able to just be so openly genocidal that they've decided that any measure of accountability or having to behave like a normal person in another country that, in Israel, Palestine, they can be as genocidal as they want, Israelis, right? And maybe they're just so used to it. They go to a place like in Europe and they're like, well, yeah, why can't I just walk around chanting death to Arabs? And it's like not being able to chant death to Arabs and brag about killing children and destroying all their schools in Gaza is somehow perceived as like an act of bigotry. I guess, yeah. Do you think these people actually think that's the case? I don't know if that's a weird question, but I genuinely struggle to understand if they know like that this is ridiculous and that they're lying, or if there really is a perceived obsessive victimhood mentality. Like, unless I can drop 2,000-pound bunker bombs on babies, you're an anti-Semite.
That's an excellent point. I think Israeli Jews, and by the way, I would say this is true of many American Jews as well, and many Jews around the world, are raised with this victimhood mentality of we always have been and we always will be persecuted. This is, like I said, a law of the universe. And that affects every aspect of Israeli society. This perception that we're surrounded by countries that want to push us into the sea. We had this rhetoric in the 1948 war. The Zionist leaders claimed, "Oh, we were, facing a Holocaust." In fact, those calls that the Arabs wanted to push the Jews into the sea in 1948, those emanated from Israeli Zionist official propaganda. In fact, Shai Haskani, a historian who spent 15 years looking for such calls in Arab press and Arab pamphlets, never found such calls in 48. Israelis did the same thing in 67, claiming the Arab states wanted to push them into the sea. And again, same thing in the early 70s, all the Israeli generals and cabinet members in the security cabinet that made the decision to go to war later came out and said, we just invented that story. That was all a fiction. There was no threats of annihilation. That was just a fiction. And the same is true all the way to the present day, where Israelis constantly need to convince the world that everyone is trying to kill them. Anti-Semitism is a threat that rages around the world today, and you even saw that in the events in Amsterdam, you had Mossad agents that were actually embedded with the hooligans. They sent Mossad agents. It's unclear exactly what they were doing there, whether they were there to instigate. I think a more conspiratorial take on this would be this was very much intentional. They were looking for a fight that they could then later claim was an act of anti-Semitism perpetrated against them when they could obviously expect there would be a fight, there would be pushback at this rampaging around Amsterdam and all these vile acts of genocidal rhetoric being spewed out at the people of the Netherlands.
Zachary, if I could ask, there's something that I think gets left out or maybe forgotten in a lot of the discussion that Rania and we've talked about quite a bit, which is that these are the people that Palestinians and Lebanese are being asked to make peace with. Like when people are talking about, two states or whatever, everyone holds hands, we need, dialogue and discussion. This is really these are many of the people, this is a majority sentiment in Israel. And these, this incident in Amsterdam is really taking place in the context of this larger, now with Trump elected, this overtly genocidal rhetoric. I mean, it was genocidal before, but it's getting even more genocidal now, where they're talking about actually annexing the West Bank. They're not even, pretending that this is about Hamas or terrorism or anything like that. What is your take on the direction of Israeli society, the emboldenment of, people like Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir? What direction is this going? How do you make sense of this?
Well, in the years, let's say in the decade that led up to October 7th, you had many calls from even mainstream Israeli leaders. Ayelet Shaked, for example, in 2014, basically compares Palestinians to insects and calls for their annihilation, says anyone who's even connected to any Hamas member is a legitimate target. A mother, a father, a brother, a son, they're all legitimate targets. She likened Palestinian women to basically giving birth to insects. essentially making these genocidal calls all the way going back to the 2014 war. Those genocidal calls continued in 2018. It was this time the Israeli defense minister at the time, Avigdor Lieberman, who again repeated the point that there are no innocent in Gaza. This was a statement made 5 years before Isaac Herzog made it in October 2023. Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, and so. I think since October 2023, we've had not dozens, but not even hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of calls for genocide. I think a January 2024 poll indicated that 95% of Jewish Israelis believed there was either the right amount of force or not enough force being used in Gaza. To say things in different words, 95% of Israeli Jews are pro-genocide. And again, that's because of the rhetoric, the dehumanizing rhetoric that Israelis have been served up in Israeli media for years, if not decades. That is because of the education system, which completely ignores and overlooks Palestinians altogether. They're just not part of the Zionist story. Zionism, the state of Israel, is a state for Jews, to protect Jews wherever they are. I mean, that's at least the claim. And so Palestinians just have nothing to do with the story. To the extent that Palestinians are relevant, is that they're an obstacle, an impediment to the Zionist dream of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. And just one final point I would make here is that I think the phrase, "You show me the incentives and I will show you the outcome," is a phrase that should be much, much more popular when thinking about Israel-Palestine, because just imagine a Palestine that had been completely vacant. Imagine a Palestine that actually had been a land without a people. What a dream that would have been for the Zionist community in Palestine before 1948. What a dream it would be even today. And so you show me the incentives and I will show you the outcome. The outcome in this case has been genocide.
Yeah, it's just incredibly, incredibly horrific. But I appreciate you coming on and breaking through that insane propaganda about Amsterdam. And I mean, now there was a game in France that I know had a lot of security at it, but it looks like nothing broke out. But I mean, it seems like everywhere Israelis go these days, they're just bringing their genocidal sentiments with them, and it's definitely making them look pretty bad on the world stage. So, Zachary Foster, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Kei, that brings us to a close. You did a fantastic job, I have to say, filling in Eugene's shoes. I'm sure Eugene will be proud of you. We all at Breakthrough News are very proud of you. Do you have any final words as we? Oh, look at that! Thank you, John. John gave you the applause.
Oh, okay. I can hear it, John. You'll have to applaud for me again. No,
you can't hear like the noises. That's
no,
all.
I
That's
can't. Yeah.
Okay.
But no, no final notes. I guess I'll just reiterate the call. Like, I think, just based on everything you've heard today, based on all the lies, whether it be in Amsterdam or about immigrants or about the Middle East, we need independent media. And that's why we started this project 5 years ago, still going strong. But, there is such a huge media apparatus. There's such a huge propaganda machine working against us. So please, if you like what we're doing here at Breakthrough, please support our Patreon. Even if it's a few dollars a month, I think the lowest tier is $5 a month. So just forego that one coffee. I promise it's not that good for you. So
Okay, Kei, you guys, Kei doesn't drink coffee.
Sorry.
Coffee.
This is going to be my thing.
essentially
Every time
talking.
you let me on the freedom side, I'm going to speak out against the evils of caffeine and
Oh, wow. Capitalism and caffeine gotta go,
yeah.
according to Kei. I don't think we're going to win anyone to the anti-capitalist cause if you go after caffeine, though. It's like
I'm
super
just saying
important
it's
to
a
people,
capitalist
so.
productivity drug.
Terrible slogan. But no, I wanna reaffirm what Kei just said. Independent media is more important than ever. And we here at Breakthrough News are able to bring you this content in our journalism because of your support. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You as little as $5 a month, but also no limit. You want to go higher, you can go higher. You can go as high as you want. The sky is the limit.
Dream big, everyone.
And I also want to remind people to make sure you smash that like button.
Smash
It
that
helps boost
like button.
Yes.
It helps boost.
Yes, and it's free.
The sound effect.
It's free.
It helps
unlike
boost in
coffee.
the algorithm. Exactly. It's wow. It's free. It's free. And on that note, Kei, thank you for filling in for Eugene. You were fantastic. For all of our viewers and listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.